Dennis Harrison wrote his first car story for Wheels magazine in 1967 when he was working for the ABC in Sydney. It was here he also devised and presented the ABC's first and only radio program on motoring called Overdrive. After almost 30 years with the corporation, working in 4 states as a radio and TV reporter, and finally as a senior network executive, he left to take up writing full-time. Nearly 300 of his features on the history of motoring have been published in Australia, the United Kingdom, Europe and the United States of America. He has produced 2 books, The Summit, The Story of an Australian Car, and a media textbook for schools. He is an arts graduate in history from the University of Sydney, so he must be a good person. Sorry, I couldn't get that one. I should forewarn him, so am I. As a member of the Sporting Car Club, he's also honorary editor of the club's monthly journal, Wheelspin, and has been responsible for, with casual efficiency, the story of the Sporting Car Club of South Australia, 1934 to 1994. He's here tonight to talk to us about the romance of the road. Would you please make welcome Dennis Harrison.
Thank you very much indeed. The romance of the road is the subject for tonight. Let's just come forward a little bit from the romance as such, and I'd like to remind you of a couple of 2 very well-known British entertainers of the 1960s, Michael Flanders and Donald Swan. Flanders was confined to a wheelchair and found flying around the world had its problems. He used to tell the audiences of his concern about aeroplanes and flying. If God had wanted us to fly, he said, he would not have invented the railways. The corollary of that statement could well be, if God had wanted us to travel by train, he would not have invented the motor car. For a time, train and car were not as far apart as they are today. We say motor car now, with an image in our minds of vehicles propelled by an internal combustion engine and fueled by an oil product. The first automobiles were just as likely to be powered by steam or by batteries. In 1900, 40% of the 4,200 vehicles sold in the United States were steam-powered, 38 were electric, and only 22% were petrol-powered. Steam engines were proven, a reliable source of power. Trains, road rollers, stationary engines, traction engines on farms, steam powered them all. That the first car built in South Australia in 1898, the Shearer, was steam powered. That was no accident. David Shearer of the Shearer Farm Machinery Manufacturing Company at Mannum well understood steam. He would not have even seen an internal combustion engine. Most of the Shearer steam car, both the original part and now that which has been rebuilt, is on display at the National Motor Museum at Burwood. If you haven't seen it for a little while, there is a reminder. I can't do that, can I? At the rear is the boiler and steam part, and as you can see, it is chain driven. To heat the water, it burnt mallee roots instead of coal. It was built as a hobby. Then Shearer realised it may have potential as a means of transport. He was invited by the Adelaide Chamber of Commerce to bring it down to the city for a demonstration. The invitation raised a storm of protest from the city council. The steam carriage would frighten the horses, it said. Eventually, however, the council agreed and provided the steamer stayed outside of the 4 terraces around the city. Now, possibly their real concern was not about the horses, but about the horse industry. Horses required stables, horse dealers, blacksmiths, wheelwrights, wagon makers, feed merchants, and farmers to produce the feed. And possibly I've even left some other people out as well. A lot of people were employed keeping horses clippity-clopping. A lot of people had money invested in horses. The Shearer steamer challenged the status quo, and the status quo challenged Shearer back. Afraid of losing his business, business from his farm machinery, for his farm machinery, David Shearer did not go on to make more steam cars. Others, notably in the United States, did, until the mid-1920s. They were built to look like petrol-powered cars. They burned kerosene, not coal, and certainly not mallee grease. They had what was called flash boilers. The water passed through tubes which could be heated relatively quickly, I mean relative compared to a steam train engine. And having ridden in one, I can tell you that they ran very smoothly. There was no gears to change. They were uncannily quiet, because there was no motor, like a petrol-powered motor, and they could go just as fast backwards as forwards. In fact, the driver, the one that I was in, gave a demonstration, and it was quite frightening. And in fact, they could be very fast indeed. In 1906, an American Stanley steamer with a streamlined wooden body set a world land speed record of 127 miles per hour, or 204 kilometres per hour. However, steam passenger cars were heavy, and heavy on using water. The invention of the electric self-starter, the petrol-driven cars, marked the end of steam cars. I mean, what owner would wish to wait for the kettle to boil, as it were, when just a switch could turn on a petrol engine? Meanwhile, back in South Australia, the very first real car was imported in 1901. It came from Belgium and was an 8-horsepower Deschamps of 2 cylinders. It was bought by Mr. F.G. Ayres, a member of the distinguished South Australian family. The Deschamps was followed only a few days later by a 2-cylinder air-cooled make called a New Orleans. And I shall just move and follow. And that is one of them, the New Orleans. Not the original one that came to South Australia, but the New Orleans nevertheless. And it was another Belgian make, but it was made under licence in England. The owner of the car was Dr. A.H. Galt. And new cars, or the first cars, were popular with general practitioners. They made making house calls much, much easier. The third car to arrive was a steam-driven locomobile from America, imported by Mr. E. Rimal. Mr. Rimal had a lot of trouble. Steam cars needed not just water, but clean water, if they were to function properly. And later steam cars had condensers to filter the water, but not the early locomobiles. And before I turn that off the moment, the next one, just imagine what a stir these cars must have created. Think back to when television began in Australia, and people went and watched it in shop windows, and neighbours with a TV set became the most popular people in the street. And although people were used to the cinema, TV was still a source of wonder. In the case of the first cars, there had been nothing like them. There was nothing which people could identify with. You can imagine how they felt when they saw the Shearer steamer. You can imagine how they felt when they saw the one we've just seen on the screen. The new cars are looked upon with awe, and even fear. In 1903 in Sydney, by which time cars were not common, but there were enough around not to be rare either, a motorist named Harry Skinner parked his car in Sydney, in the city, with the intent of going about his business. To his amazement, a traffic policeman appeared and began booking him for leaving his car unattended in the street. The officer argued that the car might start up on its own, of its own accord, and therefore was a danger to the public. Now Harry was so angry about this that he called a public meeting of motorists who decided to form an organisation to protect and defend themselves. Thus the Automobile Association of Australia was formed. A similar organisation was formed the same year in this state and called the Automobile and Motorcycling Club of South Australia, and we now know it as the RAA. And the other organisations similarly were established in other states. Now the first motorists really needed that protection. The speed limits on motor vehicles were severe and severely enforced. The general speed limit in South Australia until 1921 was 15 miles an hour. In the modern money, 24 kilometres an hour. It was less than that in the business district of Adelaide. In 1912, the limit in the city was 6 miles an hour. And the police were dedicated, not only in Adelaide but in other cities, to enforcing the speed limit. One of my favourite stories is of a zealous police inspector in Melbourne who was travelling on a tram which was overtaken by a car. The inspector decided that the car was going too fast, He got off the tram and hailed down a passing horse and sulky, got in and told the driver, in effect, "Follow that car," which he did. And the horse and sulky caught up with it, which makes one wonder how fast the car was really going. But more particularly, how fast did the horse and sulky go? With the arrival of the motor car, the horse became, if I might use the phrase, a sacred cow. New laws required cars to stop if a horse was approaching, and the driver to turn off the engine if necessary to ensure that the animal wasn't frightened. And one can imagine the driver of a car and the driver of a horse-drawn vehicle approaching each other in mutual and growing trepidation. It must be emphasised, though, in fairness to the horses and those who still have them, that the cars were the newcomers on the road, and they were the minority. Although the number of cars grew rapidly, it wasn't until the 1970s that every second person, as it were, owned a motor vehicle. In 1915, there was statistically one motor vehicle, and that means cars and trucks, for every 130 people. In 1922, one for every 50 people. And in 1939, when World War II broke out, one for every 8.5 people. Horse-drawn vehicles predominated and were prominent on the streets up to World War II. I mean, obviously there are periods in history where a meeting of this size, there may be only 2 people who actually owned a motor car. The rest of you had your horse and sulkies outside. Also prominent up to World War II was the bicycle and the motorcycle, a fact that is often forgotten, which is much to the annoyance of today's collectors of old motorcycles, who don't think they get the recognition they deserve. The motorcycle was much cheaper than a car and was a transport which those on wages aspired to. It was a working man's step up the transport ladder. That advertisement of 1912 is what you might buy for your money. You'll notice there too that it says it was big enough to carry a sidecar on it, or rather with it. And that was important because it gave the ordinary person who bought one the opportunity to have family outings, at least with a wife and baby. The motorcycles far outnumber the early motor cars, and the biggest motoring association in this state up to World War II was the Motorcycle Club of South Australia. Part of the antipathy towards motorists was that cars were the domain of the well-off, the rich, and I suppose the slang of the time, the knobs. The first cars were not for the masses, so for a moment you remove the cheaper motorcycles. The cheapest model cars in 1906 and 1907 were about £400. You could buy a good horse for £50. In today's values, £400 is roughly equal to $27,000. For that money now, you can buy a Mitsubishi Magna or Toyota Camry. A cheap car today is close to half that amount. But there was one thing the less well-off motorcyclist and the well-to-do car driver had in common. Both were unhappy with the roads at the time. Now, as often the case with technological developments of any kind, Australia was not ready for the motor car, and of course could not have been ready. One of the most popular songs in the repertoire of Peter Dawson, the greatest South Australian baritone, was a song called I Travel the Road, and it had a refrain, a gypsy am I, a wandering by, I travel the road, who cares? Well, the early motorists and motorcyclists did care. They cared very much. Until the Second World War, roads in Australia were better subjects to sing about than to travel on. Outside the capital cities, they were unsealed, rough, narrow, badly maintained and insufficient, dusty all the year round and a quagmire when it rained. Not wishing to point the bone, as it were, at South Australia over its roads, the picture of the road I'm about to show you is a Queensland road. The notion of horses, the idea of horses having to come to the rescue of cars, it did happen. It is not a pretty sight. In fact, I don't know if anybody from the Model T Ford Club here tonight, so I can speak freely. I think that is about 1910, 1911, or at the worst 1912. Maintenance of roads was often basic. If a road needed draining, a V-shaped channel was dug across it, providing a nasty bump which a simple horse-drawn vehicle could cope with, albeit with a bit of a jolt, but which could throw a lighter car or a motorcycle off the road. And that the same thing could happen with the odd rock or tree stump. The roads were inadequate, so the motor car's great virtue, sustained travel. It wasn't so much that cars would go as fast as a horse, or as a fast horse, and even faster. They did not need to stop to have a rest. Cars would go for longer, and consequently for longer distances. The car opened up the prospect of driving from Adelaide to Melbourne, from Sydney to Melbourne, from Sydney to Newcastle. But the coach roads of the 19th century, which the 20th century inherited, were inadequate for such trips by car, and possibly weren't very good when they were used by coaches. Most travellers went between the cities by coastal steamer or by train, and as for country areas of South Australia, ships also took travellers from Adelaide to ports on the Spencer Gulf. Nevertheless, the inadequate roads did not stop the first motorists from having a go at inter-capital city travel. In 1903, Mr. Ben Thompson, with a friend, were the first motorists to drive from Adelaide to Melbourne in a single cylinder to Dion Bouton. And we must have a look at the Dion Bouton because it's quite a significant car in the history of motoring. This popular French make was ubiquitous around the world, as the Ford Model T was to be 10 years later, and the Volkswagen 50 years later, and as were the first Holdens in Australia. In 1903, the Dion Bouton constituted 50% of all the cars produced in the world. And whatever it may look like to you from there, the Dion Bouton is simple, sturdy, and reliable. The route from Adelaide to Melbourne was not as direct as it is today. And Mr. Thompson took 3 days for the trip, of which 38 hours was driving time at an average speed of 13 miles an hour. In 1907, 29-year-old Oswald Watt, the well-off son of the founder of a successful Australian shipping company, set off in another Dion Bouton to set a Sydney to Melbourne record in a car. Watt and his mechanic carried their own petrol supply in tin. There was no going with Shell or being sure of BP. They could not bank on finding many chemist shops on the route, the places where motorists first bought petrol. The trip did not get off to a good start. The car became bogged before it left the outskirts of Sydney, so it took 9 hours to cover the first 16 miles. Another 7 hours were lost when the radiator was damaged by a tree stump in the middle of the road. But they did get to Melbourne. It took them 2 3/4 days. Now, despite the vicissitudes of these first journeys, they drew attention to the potential of the car for bridging the vast distances of Australia, and as such provided ammunition for the motoring organisations in their lobby for better roads. By now, you may well be asking, where is the romance of the road which you came here tonight to hear? Well, it was definitely there. First, there was the convenience of owning a car and a sense of freedom. Freedom from trams, train timetables, and freedom from maintaining the infrastructure necessary to keep a horse. There was something liberating about owning a car. You had independence. Also, if you traded in your horse for a car, you were actually contributing to a better environment. Look, it's easy to condemn the first motor cars as the beginning of the end of civilization as it used to be. It is worth noting, however, that at the end of a day spent by a horse in the city of Adelaide, that horse would have deposited over 4.5 kilograms of manure onto the streets. And of course it wasn't the only horse doing it. The manure was not only objectionable, but coupled with dust and wind was a serious threat to public health. Horse feces were host to the tetanus virus. Even a minor abrasion incurred on the streets opened up the risk of fatal infection. But back to the man. There was pride in owning a car. Countless photograph albums contained pictures of the family of the previous generation standing in front of the family car. Motor historians are often frustrated by large families who virtually hid the car from sight, making identifying it impossible. Now, in particular, there was also a camaraderie among early motorists, as both an exclusive minority and as an occasionally persecuted one. The Automobile Association of South Australia regularly held picnics for its members. Belair Park was a popular destination. And what a marvellous display of different vehicles there were at such picnics. Until the Great Depression of 1929, there was literally hundreds of different makes throughout the world vying just for a share in a new industry. Even after an inevitable rationalisation, there were in the United States alone, in 1920, more than 300 different makes. And make did not necessarily mean made. Many car makers bought parts made by others and assembled cars and put bodies on them. Engines could be bought from the Dion or the Continental Engine Company in America, who made nothing else but engines, 4 and 6 cylinders, large and small. Now, between 1895 and 1902, a mere 7 years, the Dion produced 33,000 engines for other cars' makes. But let's come back to the picnic. Picnics were popular with new motorists, coupled as they were with the Sunday drive, which became an institution and replaced the walk in the park. A Sunday drive became what every wife and mother expected at the weekend, after a week of cooking and homemaking. And those first hardy motor picnickers did not ask, where's the esky, or will there be a coin in the slot gas barbecue? No, there was a basket and a kettle over the fire laid by the children. Some music perhaps? By all means, sing if you want to. Or did somebody bring a piano accordion with them? Not until the 1920s was auto entertainment, if I can coin that word, extended by the portable wind-up gramophone, provided there was room enough in the car to carry one. At the end of the 1920s, the first car radios appeared, but they were a luxury. Even by 1934, a radio cost the equivalent of nearly $700 in today's money. They were really a luxury. The extension to the picnic was to go camping in a motor car, and for that purpose there were helpful hints and equipment to make camping as cheap as possible, and I'll just show you a couple of them. But it couldn't do much cheaper than the top picture. As you'll gather, you just simply wrapped up the bed in the canvas cover and put it on a running board. Many present-day motorists of any age will regret the passing of the running board. It had so many useful purposes. And just a matter of extending it out. Here, in the lower picture, things get a little bit more sophisticated. This was a proprietary invention. You could buy this and lay it on the tops of the seats, and you could sleep on top of it. Personally, I don't think it looks very comfortable, but those things did have their appeal. From the outset, too, the romance of motorsport surrounded the car as well. Not only racing, which had always had a degree of specialisation, but motorcarners, reliability trials and hill climbs, which any motorist could take part in, to test the mettle of their car and their own. The ability of a car to climb a hill was regarded as the ultimate test in the early days. That a car could go faster than a horse or a bicycle was not in doubt, but could it climb a hill without stopping, and could it climb better than some other car? That was a challenge facing each make and every new car salesman. Some potential customers stipulated which hill the car had to be able to climb to have their proof. Stories abound of salesmen demonstrating cars and coming to a hill which looked like it could be a bit of a struggle, and telling the potential buyer that the car was so good it could go up this steep hill backwards, and then doing so. The reverse being the lowest gear, a satisfactory performance was guaranteed. Now, if such customers sound gullible, bear in mind they probably had never seen a car before, let alone knew how they worked. There is, by the way, another side to that kind of story. A car salesman in Adelaide, the early 1900s, Mr. Bert Searcy, recalled an elderly customer asking for a demonstration drive up the hill on Frome Road. And the car went up in top gear, no changing down to a lower gear. Mr. Searcy thinks, no, there, we've made the point. But the customer was anxious not to be tricked somehow by a salesman. He demanded that the car be driven up the hill again in each of the lower gears. At the competitive level, the Automobile Association of South Australia conducted hill climb competitions in 1907 and 1908, and the favoured hills for testing or for competition were Tapley's Hill, Anstey's Hill and the Old Belair Road. The first major reliability trial was in 1905 from Sydney to Melbourne. It was organised by the Dunlop Rubber Company to promote its tyres. It was held in February. During the wetter winter months, the road to Melbourne was impassable. Now, the trial wasn't a race. It took place over 5 daily stages. The aim was to achieve an average speed of 14 miles per hour by lighter weight cars and 16 miles per hour by the heavy cars. The vehicles could be repaired en route without any penalty. The 23 cars and 10 motorcycles which took part included a woman driver, Mrs. Ben Thompson, the wife of Mr. Ben Thompson, who had gone across from Adelaide to Melbourne, and who herself had driven to Melbourne a year after her husband. We must have a look at Mrs. Thompson. At the time, particularly early days of motoring, there didn't seem to be fun made of women being at the wheel. You know, the women driver joke seems to come much, much later. Mrs. Thompson's car there, and the one she drove in the trial, was a 6-horsepower Wolseley from Britain. Water in the carburettor in crossing a creek cost her a winning place, which he was among the 21 who finished. 4 heavy cars, 3 light cars, and 2 motorcycles came through without a loss of points. To decide the winner, the organisers had these entries drive another 70 miles west of Melbourne and back, with a point deducted every minute they had to stop. A Scottish Argyle, which was a very large manufacturer at the time, won the heavy class, and a Dion Duton the light class. A crowd estimated that more than 12,000 welcomed the cars into Melbourne. The trial did much to increase the public acceptance of the automobile, and Dunlop Rubber was so pleased that it held another trial in November of the same year, from Melbourne to Sydney. The driver of the winning Argyle, the first time, Harley Tarrant, entered again, driving a 2-cylinder car of his own manufacture, called the Tarrant. He had hopes of producing an Australian car. The second Dunlop trial attracted 28 cars and 10 motorcycles who were challenged by the same conditions as the first trial. Dependency on cans of petrol from stores along the way, lots of dust, rocks, punctures, creeks and culverts across the road. 19 competitors made it to Sydney, 7 with maximum scores. So the organisers decided to send these cars a further 60 miles or so across the Blue Mountains west of Sydney. Only 1 of the 7 lost points. Now, rather than keep sending them back and forwards to the mountains until there was a winner, which was actually the first suggestion, the trial was instead extended back to Melbourne. And incredibly, the competitors agreed to this, and of course, public interest rose quite considerably. The cars were welcomed, not surprisingly, in Melbourne by a bigger crowd than before. However, there were still 5 entries with maximum points, including the Australian Tarrant. I think mercifully for everyone, they were all declared to be the winners. The appeal of reliability trials, long and short, to the ordinary motorist was to remain until the 1960s, by which time motorsport of any kind had become increasingly professional activity. The Round Australia trial, the first Round Australia trial, in 1953, was actually halfway round Australia, the famous Red X trial, attracted 168 entries. More than 3/4 of the drivers had never competed in a motorsport event in their lives before. And this was an event which one could talk about at great length, it's a subject of its own, which created tremendous public interest. I'll just show a couple of illustrations. Firstly, this is what everybody imagined it was like. In reality, things could look a little like this. That is the 1955 Red X trial, and at the wheel of that Holden is a man called Possum Kipling. His name is Les, actually, he's always known as Possum. He was a truck contractor from Lee Creek, and he competed in the first Red X trial and almost won. It's just in the last section, I think a bolt went on his suspension, and he lost. Possum Kipling was a remarkable character, and I shall digress from the script for a moment to say a couple of words about him. He drove the whole first Red X trial with his hand on the steering wheel and his arm on the door, and he just drove like that, and drove flat out all the time. He'd had a fair bit of practice in the north of the state, bad road conditions. He also clenched his teeth, and this got a bit painful, so he took them out and put them in his pocket, which was fine. Then he had a bit of a breakdown, which required him to get underneath the car, and he fixed that up and got in, and off he went again in a particular section. After 80 miles, he patted his pocket and realised his teeth had gone. So he turned round and drove the 80 miles back, and there they were, they'd fallen out of his pocket, and there they were sitting in the middle of the road in the dust. He picked them up, put them in his pocket, and off he went again. I just thought I'd drop that in. The very first trials, like the Dunlop trial, showed how reliable the early motor cars could be. Now, the modern stereotype of vintage and veteran cars, or veteran and vintage to put in the right order, broken down by the roadside, blowing clouds of smoke and making bangs, is a caricature. Certainly the first cars could have troubles. Some had faults which were inherent in their design and would need rectifying. Vital parts are often exposed to easy damage. And most assuredly, there was a need for much more regular maintenance than is required today. But that's after 90 years of engineering and technological development. The earlier cars, you couldn't afford to neglect them, but given care, most could be depended on. Punctures, the bane of motorists for many years, are another matter. Here again the horse raises not so much its head, but its hooves. The first tyres were no match against horseshoe nails, which fell out and were liberally distributed on the road, nor against a discarded horseshoe, which could cut a tyre right through. The greatest proof of reliability came from those motorists who took their cars where a car had never been before, or even perhaps a wheeled vehicle of any kind. There is no more inspiring example than that of the two South Australians, Harry Dutton and his mechanic, Murray Aunder, who drove the first car from Adelaide to Darwin in 1908, an English Talbot, a journey of 2,100 miles, only one-third of which had any semblance of a track. It was their second attempt in 1908. They had tried it the year before in the wet season, another Talbot, and became hopelessly bogged. They left the car behind, and by good fortune they came across a camel train, which took them to the railhead. Otherwise they may have lost their lives. The second expedition was in the dry winter. Like the first car, the four-cylinder Talbot was fitted with a special box body to carry food, water, petrol and equipment. The major fuel supplies were sent from Adelaide by rail and then by camel to be left along the route, and also to Darwin by sea, to be carried south by pack horses to isolated settlements along the track. The first 500 miles were accomplished without serious difficulty. And during the course of that first 500 miles, they met up with a cyclist. And remember, this is in the middle of Australia in 1908. In an extraordinary coincidence, it turned out to be the eccentric Francis Berkeley, who was riding a bicycle across Australia from west to east, one of his many Trans-Australia journals. And he just happened to bump into Dutton and Aunder. After the first 500 miles, there was nothing but tribulation for the Talbot and its drivers. Unfortunately, they did take pictures. This could be described as fairly rough country. Great channels had been cut across the land by the previous year's torrential rain, when seemingly dry creeks were actually muddy in quicksand. High banks had to be dug out to get across rivers. Improvised and dangerously unstable causeways had to be built. To pass over the rugged MacDonald Ranges, boulders had to be pushed off the track. Beyond the mountains, stumps were hidden in tall grass, and the ground was dotted with a solid nest of termites. After 30 days of travel, Dutton and Aunder had found their first Talbot, and after some repairs they drove on in both cars. Miles of punishing ruts and cracks which jammed the wheels were followed by dense trackless bush. Surprisingly, they only experienced 3 punctures during the entire trip. That's the two cars, quite similar as you can see in body. On the far right is one of the higher of the termite nests. The rest of it tend to be hidden in the grass. And they'd be quite hard things to hit. 300 miles from Darwin, a tribe of Aborigines had set fire to a huge area of trees, bush and grassland to get rid of dead undergrowth. And the Talbots were forced to make a 10-mile dash through the smoke and flames. After that, miles of tropical rainforest lay ahead before Darwin could be reached. At a gold mining town, they were told it would be impossible to get through. Now they refused to accept this. They abandoned the first Talbot and pressed on in the other one. They pushed their way a yard at a time to arrive in Darwin 51 days after leaving Adelaide, almost twice as long as they'd expected. The actual travelling time was 42 days, with distances covered ranging from 8 to 70 miles a day. It was a triumph for Dutton and Aunder, it was a triumph for the Talbot, and it was certainly a triumph for the motor car. Now behind the romance and adventure associated with cars has been a group of men often maligned and rarely mentioned historically. I'm referring to the new car dealer, or as they were first called, agents. agents for a particular make, or in the early days for several makes. They were and have been the risk takers. Anyone can make something. Getting someone to buy it is another matter. A number of the first agents were already in the bicycle business. Their extension into motorcycle cars was often a natural progression. The manufacturers of bicycles they represented had themselves expanded into motor cars. Famous British car makes like Humber, Riley, Rover and Triumph began as bicycle manufacturers. In the case of the Riley Company, they were master weavers who went from making weaving machines to bicycles and then to cars. And it is strange actually to see in early newspaper advertisements, if you want to find out an advertisement for a second-hand car before the First World War in the newspaper, the advertiser, you look it up under bicycles and motor cars. Bicycle agents would have had a machine shop too, mechanical skills, the assembly and manufacturing of bicycles, which became the basis for servicing cars. Some had actually experimented with fitting petrol engines to bicycles. Of course, there were others, however, with no association with bicycles or even horses, who became agents for cars because they saw a future for the motor industry. They thought the car was there to stay. Now, one such agent in Adelaide was George Montague May. He came to Adelaide from New South Wales in 1903 at the age of 28 to be the general manager of a new South Australian branch of Beale and Company, the piano makers. But the new car caught his fancy. He started motoring by buying a motorcycle, one of the first sidecars in the state. After he'd saved some money, he graduated to his first car, an Oldsmobile, followed by a French Darracq, and then a British Humber, and he was really caught. He liked the Humber, and its agents, Shoemakers, Cycle and Motor Works, importers and agents, the whole lot, were in Victoria Square, close to Beale's premises. In 1910, May left Beale's and bought out Shoemakers, which became May's Motor Works. And so he was agent for Humber and Wolseley, and in 1912 he took on a number of other American and British makes. He was quite a leading agent of his day, and his whole family was involved. And he prospered. When he bought a new house in St Peters, he actually called it Wolseley. In South Australia, well into the 1920s, there were few car agencies in the country areas, and local garages preferred to concentrate on repairs and selling oil and fuel. So car salesmen, including May's car salesman, spent a lot of time away from Adelaide selling and delivering cars which had been ordered. I actually met George May's daughter a couple of years ago, who's in New South Wales now, and she told me the mad flurry at Christmas time to fulfil car orders. She was only 16 and she was working in the office, but sort of had to be taught to drive or learn to drive herself, just to be one other person, though, to get the cars out of the country and fulfil the orders. I mean, it's quite an exciting matter getting the cars. I mean, they came by ship. It was never quite clear to the agents when exactly they were going to arrive, and quite often they were selling cars they didn't have, and so quick delivery was very important. The motor car and trucks were attractive to the farming community, and bear in mind too that the population of the state in the first quarter of this century at least was close to evenly balanced between city and country. South Australian car salesmen were as ingenious as others anywhere in the world. In the 1920s, when it wasn't difficult to park in the streets of Adelaide, and parking was virtually unrestricted, the agents would park a new model in various streets during the day so people could see it. During lunchtime, Rundle Mall was a good spot. Rundle Street, was a good spot. So too was outside the Adelaide Club, or the South Australian Hotel, the Liberal Club, or even park a car outside Parliament House. At night, a car would be parked outside a picture theatre, mainly Wednesdays, Fridays and Saturdays. So patrons would see it if they came out at interval to stretch their legs or have a smoke. It often fell to the salesman to teach a new owner the rudiments of how to drive. It could be crucial in clinching the sale. There was no test needed to gain a driver's licence, and it was simply a matter of going on to the police station, asking for one and paying the fee. So the salesman was able to fulfil this task, or otherwise simply point to the handbook and say, that's how you do it. There was, however, one quirk that I'd like to mention about the licence system. Despite federation in 1901, as late as 1934, it was necessary to obtain a permit to drive a vehicle registered in one state in another state. For example, if you drove from South Australia to Victoria on a holiday. A motorist from another state was required to apply for a permit at the nearest police station after crossing the border. This inconvenience was lessened only slightly in 1934 in respect to Victoria. The South Australian Motor Vehicles Department arranged for permits to be obtained beforehand at its office in Adelaide before the driver left the state. The motorist not only had to present himself with his driver's licence and his car's registration certificate, his mainstream history, as if there had been no significance, whereas the car became part of the very fabric of our society and has touched and touches the lives of everyone, including those who held the highest office in the land. Now, in that context, there has been much comment of late on the other side of politics about Sir Robert Menzies, having been a fanatical Anglophile, British through and through. Now, it's interesting to note that as Prime Minister, Menzies' favourite official car was a big American post-war Buick. It was his first car when his term of office began in 1949, and he never wanted to give it up. After a couple of years, the Transport Department attempted to provide him with a British Humber. "What's this?" he asked, so the story goes. "Where's my car?" And back came the Buick. Sometime later, the Buick was getting a little older and the matter was becoming quite serious. The Transport Department substituted a Rolls-Royce. They thought that would make Sir Robert happy. Again, "Where's my car?" And eventually the Buick had to be replaced, and it was simply worn out. The most appropriate new car for the purpose was of British manufacture, and it was a situation which Menzies accepted reluctantly. Now, I don't know if our present Prime Minister knows this story, and perhaps I should write and tell him. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I'm sorry, can I just quickly add, sponsorship reminds me, because talking about WEDEX trials and the Australia trials, we have a picture of Fiat who was in, I think, in an Ampol trial, and I know the man who's in it, who drove it, he and his partner, and on the side of it, it says, "Brawn," the electric razor people. You think, gosh, they put all that money behind Reg and, they did that. It's the only sponsorship they got, and all they got was actual razor. There was nothing else. But right across the car. I'm sorry, is there anything else we'd like to talk about? I could suggest if they had enough money to be able to do it. They didn't, though, did they? I think your last comment is the answer, actually. The technology did advance very quickly. I mean, by the 1930s, what we now call the veteran cars up to 1918 were regarded as old crops. They were not held in any regard at all, and that would have been because the technology went ahead so quickly. But then you got the reverse. You see, once you came to depression, you could read in the 1930s the people writing to the advertiser saying, "I have a 1922 Whippet and it's giving me trouble, and this is a symptom. What can I do about it?" People are hanging on to those cars. And then, of course, you've got the war with it. In the Second World War, of course, people did hang on to cars. I mean, the first car magazines after the war were giving people advice on how to look after their 1929 Chev. This is 1945, because that's what people still had. And suddenly, everybody then wanted to get rid of them as soon as the new cars came out. And that is probably what happened. Prosperity is a terrific way to get rid of old cars. I've not heard that. I appreciate hearing that, because I hadn't heard that before. I mean, the other side of it too, allied with Ford, is that the steam car manufacturers never came down market. They were always expensive. And of course, Ford came in underneath, and nobody's going to bother buying a steam car. But that's interesting. I hadn't heard that one before. You mentioned also, of course, the question of salt and damage to cars. I mean, what struck me when we first came to South Australia 20 years ago is how well preserved cars are here compared to Sydney and New South Wales. Again, because of the dry climate. You won't get much rain, but the cars last longer. But the preservation, that has a lot to do with it. I didn't think that was a romantic subject. Well, I will start a couple. I will start saying that my own father detested the idea of having gas producers. And he had a 1925 Morris Cowley at the time. As he worked in the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation's factory, Commonwealth Aircraft Factory, he was able to get hold somehow to ask these questions. get hold of aeroplane fuel, aviation gas, which he broke down with kerosene, and ran the Morris Cowley on that because he wouldn't dare have anything to do with the gas producer. However, other people did, and remember, they either carried on the roof on a rack, you either could tow them behind in a trailer, or you could have them mounted on the back of the car. Or even in the front, that's right. You know more about gas producers than I do. And, well, Susan and I'll have a little chat about this. Wood was the usual, wasn't it, for burning? Charcoal, charcoal, right? Right. So that was coke charcoal, yes, right, coke, yes. I know it's also the older mechanics, or apprentices at the time, told me that nothing worse they hated they were servicing a car, they had to clean the gas producer out. It was virtually like being the fireman's offside on the railway. It was quite a dirty job. No, it didn't help, did it? No, it didn't. The first utility officially was 1934, and that was put out by Ford. There are two stories well known about this. The first one was that a Ford dealer was approached. The Depression was still having its effect in 1934. Ford dealer was approached by a farmer who said how unhappy he was. He short of money, and he really needed a car to take the wife to church on Sunday. He also needed a truck to carry, in this case I think it was pigs or livestock. And what a pity there wasn't something that he could have. And suddenly this Ford dealer thought, my God, he needs a utility. That's how the story goes. I think it was quite as fast as that. But I should mention, almost need a pencil and paper for this, but those of you who remember road cars, which came down, the dicky seat in the back and all that, in America certainly there were, the manufacturers did put out roses with a dicky seat taken out and a tray put in the back, a box put in the back. But certainly Australia has to its credit the coupe utility, the integral body tray, the back part, carrying part, and the rest of the car. Needless to say, Sir Lawrence Hartnett, in his book about the history of General Motors Holden, or his own story actually, he claims that he first thought about it, or that he thought about it coincidentally at the same time as Ford. Nevertheless, it's ours. To come back to the cutting down of cars, yes, that was very common, to cut cars down and put utility bodies on them, or tray bodies on them, buckboard type bodies. And I'm rather sorry, I don't know how enthusiasts feel about this, I'm rather sorry when old cut-down car utes, as it were, are discovered, and the first thing people do is put a proper Tourer body back on it. It's nice to see a few of them around, showing what people did with them, because it's very much part of our history. The answer would be yes. That's a safe answer, because it's very hard, one of those hard developments is very hard to pin down. I mean, the garages at home, in people's homes, stables. It was stables. When exactly? Like for those people who bought a car and had a horse before. Those who didn't probably put a shed up. Then basically it was a shed. I think that is interesting. I hadn't heard that one before. Certainly there were obviously less women doing it. For one reason, of course, there was only one car in the family, and so let's assume that the husband went to work, and because cars were, that's the first thing, we took the car and didn't have it to use. But bear in mind too that physically a car could be a heavy thing for a woman to drive. It didn't stop everybody doing the driving. That's why electric cars were popular, because most of them were expensive. And only few came out to Australia because they were so easy to drive. Those women like Mrs. Thompson we saw a while ago, there were quite a few women like her, particularly in the mid-20s. And I'm trying to remember, I'm just doing some memories of the past. There were two women I remember came through Adelaide in 1927 who were driven from Perth on their way to Sydney, and that was quite unusual. That was a trip. And also, women would turn up in Adelaide, quite extraordinary, things like baby Austins, tiny Austins, having English women, having started off in England and driven again down through Persia, India, and down to Australia. But obviously they were not prominent, you're quite right. So you're right. There was a person I must not mention, there weren't that many of them. So I did think that in the earliest days, they were treated, respected far more than later on. I mean, the jokes about women drivers in the RAA's SA Motor back in the 20s are appalling. The Bay to Burwood run is supposed to commemorate the issuing of the first driver's licence. And again, I've forgotten the year and I've also forgotten the name. when the test came in, that's right. This is one of the latest. This is on the last state. This is on the last states to require a test. You've got to put that into context with what the motor buggy meant to America. It was unique to America. I mean, some were imported here, and there are some in Adelaide still. It was unique to America, and it was designed in such a way to appeal to the farmers of the Midwest. International Harvester Company was one of the first, and what they literally set out to produce a motor car, quite out of date actually. When they first came out, it was about 1314, by which time the car had made some progress. But no, they produced these, especially the farmers, so the farmers would feel in the Midwest that they were still with the horse and buggy. Only the horse was missing. And the reason for the iron wheels was twofold, with their iron tyres, Woodworth iron tyres. They would still follow the same ruts in the road as the horse-drawn vehicles had done, so that made travelling supposedly easier, because roads in America could sometimes become good as well as good. And I think, again, for the horse reason, the iron wheels would be no punctures. But they're quite an extraordinary, peculiar rather, American phenomenon. As did the buses too, the first buses, which made for quite a hard ride, obviously. I mean, it matched against fairly simplistic stringing. You got a fairly rough ride. So I guess all things are relative, aren't they? If you've been having a rough ride in a horse-drawn, or slow and rough ride in a horse-drawn train, then you were probably thought riding in a vehicle with hard tyres was much, much better. I'm not sure. It was Britain that kept going with steam commercials like the Sentinel, and kept going with those steam-driven buses and particular steam-driven trucks. Well, there have been experiments with steam vehicles, in relatively recent times. There was an Australian car emerged in the 1970s called a Pritchard. There was only one of them. It was based on a Ford Falcon, on about 62 Ford Falcons from memory, and they were attempting to produce a modern-day steam car. I don't think that they have much of a future. The first all-steel bodies were Dodge, which a Bud was the company in America, in about 1930, 1931. I wonder if it was all steel or didn't have a wooden frame. It must. What do you mean? It had an overall steel? Yes. No, so yes. You could come back to about 1929, 1930. Some of the first steel bodies, if you like, the whole roof was a fabric panel, because they simply couldn't make bodies complete with that shape and taking the top as well. So the hood went out, but bear in mind, for quite a number of years before it went, it was parallel with the others. It was more a question of being able to build car bodies, as we were just saying. That's why the hood was there. That was the simplest way to have a covering over your head. Then, of course, you end up with side screens and everything else. There were some attempts, you shouldn't start a minute, there were some attempts to make metal alternatives to the canvas hood. You simply bought them as a proprietary item, as an accessory, and they had sliding windows. You just sort of took your hood off and plonked it down on top of the body of the car. And there's a rugby here somewhere, because I've seen it at meeting at Carnegie, that has one of those. Californian tops, they were called.
On behalf of the people present tonight, I'd like to thank Senator Harrison very much indeed for giving this very informative address. The early history of motoring in the world, of course, is a fascinating one, and South Australia was not very far behind the rest of the world in motoring and the development of the motoring organisations and the various interests and uses of motor vehicles. Probably the greatest transfer of change that's happened, and certainly the most dramatic as far as the ordinary people were concerned, was the advent of rail, not all that many years before the advent of the motor car. So of course the motor car is very much more individual and family type method of transport, which has made the world very much smaller as far as the ordinary family and individual is concerned. And the fascinating stories that
we can relate in regards to the motor vehicle. It's certainly been brought forward tonight, and we thank Dennis very much for that. I've got particular thanks to him. I didn't realise that Mays were distributors of considerable motor vehicles back in the early part of the century. I knew of Southern Motors, which were related distributors in South Australia, but having particular interest in Sydney or Armstrong Sydney motor cars, I was very pleased to pick up that very important piece of history. And I'm sure that everyone tonight has picked up some valuable points of interest in the motoring story. And so I'd like you to show your appreciation to Dennis Harrison for a very informative and entertaining course. Thank you very much.